do it again until it's the best you can really do. And so many of the successful graduates talk about how they actually didn't like school, or they didn't fit into the program, or how they were kind of restless and frustrated in the schooling environment. Many of them performed poorly in school. Like Einstein himself got C's in school. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a C student. There are many others too that you could cite as examples. Some of them just frankly dropped out altogether. Here's a list of famous school dropouts. Here you have Thomas Edison, the greatest inventor of all time and a multimillionaire. He dropped out after 3 months of elementary school. Benjamin Franklin, arguably the smartest founding father, dropped out at age 10 after 2 months. Albert Einstein dropped out of high school at age 15, performed poorly on tests. When he did finally go back into schooling to try and get college degrees, he was turned down at first, and it was just a big schooling failure. He only succeeded despite unbeatable odds. Here we also see John D. Rockefeller, history's first billionaire. Rockefeller himself dropped out of high school. Isn't that ironic? Walt Disney dropped out of high school. And I should say, as a quick disclaimer here, these people are not necessarily role models, right? They're just people who had economic success and did something different. So that's not to say that these are people we want to be like. So you probably knew that, but just in case. Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Atlantic Airways and Virgin Records, dropped out of high school to start his own business. Colonel Sanders, founder of KFC, dropped out of elementary school. Charles Dickens dropped out at age 12 to work in a factory for 10 hours per day. Elton John dropped out at age 11. Ray Kroc, the McDonald's tycoon, dropped out of high school at age 15. Isn't that interesting? We also see here Tumblr founder David Karp dropped out of high school at the age of 15 and eventually sold his New York startup company for $1.1 billion. And Blip TV founder Mike Hudak also dropped out of high school. We see some more examples. The top tech company founders of the 20th century. These are the top guys, right? Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Paul Allen, Michael Dell. What did these guys do? They dropped out of college to start their own companies. The founders of Whole Foods, The Container Store, CNN, all these tech companies, Dig, Napster, Blogger, Facebook, WordPress, Dropbox, Box.net, and numerous other tech companies all dropped out of college to start their own companies. And if this is, by the way, a small sampling of the total. If all these people had such tremendous success in being innovators, do we have to ask ourselves, is schooling as necessary as we thought? Maybe people who succeed with lots of schooling are succeeding in spite of schooling, not because of it in many cases. By the way, I should mention as a disclaimer, dropping out and not having Prussian-style schooling is not a good thing in and of itself. It's what you replace it with that counts for something, right? The negation of Prussian schooling, I mean, you could just sit there and stare at a white blank wall all day, or you could play video games all day, and then you're going to amount to nothing, of course, right? So it's the fact that these people had a drive and had something interesting to do and had a pursuit and had a passion. I want to tell you the story also of David Sarnoff. He became the president of RCA, one of the most influential individuals in telecommunications history. Well, he emigrated from Russia as a child. He was completely unschooled when he arrived. He learned to read English in 5 months without any schooling. And then he began to sell newspapers at age 9 to support their now fatherless family. His father had died at that time. By age 14, he owned his own newsstand. And he wanted to work at Marconi Wireless, so he saw an ad for an office boy job application, and he ran in. There was a line of 500 other boys, and he said, no, I'm not going to wait in that line. He runs right in, he opens the door, barges right in, goes to the boss and says, I want this job. I'll be the best employee you've ever had. And he uses that strength of fortitude. He was hired on the spot. And so by the end, by 23 years later, he was the president of the company. All without any schooling, right? John Taylor Gatto, the New York City and New York State Teacher of the Year, has a very interesting comment on how David Sarnoff succeeded. He says the following: Sarnoff was able to move so rapidly because he got a chance to think about serious matters before his 8th birthday, to live a significant life before he was 10. He got a chance to add value to his family and community before he was 15, and a chance to follow his own instincts and ambitions ever after. What school do you know these days that would allow all of that? And I can't disagree with his question. Really, maybe we need to rethink this whole thing. I love the story he also tells. John Taylor Gatto says, I once had a 13-year-old Greek boy named Stanley who only came to school 1 day a month and got away with it because I was his homeroom teacher and doctored the records. By the way, I don't recommend this. It's just an interesting story. Let's read on. I did it because of where he spent the time instead. Stanley had 5 aunts and uncles, all in business for themselves before they were 21. a florist, an unfinished furniture builder, a delicatessen owner, a small restaurateur, and a delivery service operator. Stanley was passed from store to store doing free labor in exchange for an opportunity to learn the business. This way, I decide which business I like well enough to set up for myself, he told me. You tell me what books to read and I'll read them, but I don't have time to waste in school unless I want to end up like the rest of these people, working for somebody else. After I heard that, I couldn't, in good conscience, keep him locked up. Isn't that an interesting story? Really, if somebody's got initiative and ambition, school may be doing more harm than good, as I said. This statement from Education says, the youth are sent to school to acquire knowledge by the study of books, cut off from the responsibilities of everyday life. They become absorbed in study and often lose sight of its purpose. Upon their graduation, thousands find themselves out of touch with life. And there is no doubt in my mind that this Jesuit-style, Prussian-style education needs to be re-examined, just based upon this statement alone. It's disconnected from real life, isn't it? In a study on divergent thinking, they actually found that 98% of children aged 3 to 5 scored in what would qualify as creative genius. So children, naturally, young children, have a curiosity, a way of thinking, a divergent way of thinking, a creativity that qualifies them to be a genius. Literally, everybody is born with genius capabilities. And there's something that happens along the line that beats this out of us, that trains this out of us. Because watch what happens after age 3 to 5. After 5 years of schooling, they retested the same children, and only 32% of them ranked as creative geniuses. After 5 more years of school, only 10% of them. And by age 25, only 2% of the population remain as divergent thinkers. Creativity, curiosity, initiative are natural human characteristics. School and media addiction sap the kids of their natural genius. I love what Albert Einstein said. He says it's a miracle that curiosity survives a formal education. Isn't that something? So what do we do with our out-of-the-classroom time? That's the question. Are we pursuing interests to see what God's calling in our lives is? Do we have a passion to learn academic knowledge and skills and how the world works and how to win souls and all of these important last days considerations to live a full life? Or do we just say, school is dumb and boring, so I'm going to go get entertained and immerse myself in media? That's the present reality. And people say, you know, these teenagers, though, they are just bored in school, and that's their fault. Well, maybe it's not. The longer kids are in school, when they're first in school, they're all rearing to go. They're excited. And the longer they're in school, the more bored they get and the more negative feelings they have towards school. And you know what lesson they learn in school more than anything else? The lesson is that learning is drudgery. That learning is boring. That learning is something to be avoided whenever possible for the most part. And believe it or not, kids, even in turn of the century, 20th century factories, these miserable, unsafe conditions, they were far happier there than in the Jesuit Prussian-style schools that were coming in. Helen Todd published a report called Why Children Work in McClure's magazine in 1913. She surveyed hundreds of children working in the factories who had escaped the compulsory schooling laws. And what we found is that 82% of the kids working there said that they would rather work in the factories than return to these factory schools, if you will. So these miserable working conditions were less miserable than Prussian schooling. And it's a modern example too. In 1982, 8,000 Milwaukee children, youth rather, high school age kids who had left high school to work, they were asked the following question. If you could return to school and get paid the same amount that you get paid to work at this job, would you do it? And you know what? Out of 8,000 of them, only 16 said that they would willingly go back to school and get paid for it. And people blame the teenager. They said the teenager is just a naturally apathetic age. It's adolescence. They just kind of float through life and they enter into this weird holding pattern before they become adults and they'll just grow out of it. Is this thing inevitable? It's not. Research has shown it. Research has been done on kids who have escaped the compulsory schooling system, like homeschool kids, for example. They're not products of modern schooling. And so what is the difference? Through adolescence, they retain their natural curiosity, their zest for learning and for life, all the way through childhood and into adulthood, all the way through adolescence. They don't go through this period. You know, we have a 5-year-old, right? A 5-year-old is naturally curious. He wants to learn. He's out about doing everything. He's asking questions. He loves life. He's creative. And then all of a sudden, we assume, well, just because we've been taught that this is the way things are supposed to go. Well, once he's 5, he's supposed to go to